mind, we stay with this particular theme and speak to economist Dr Nthabiseng Moleko, who is going to just share her reflections and expectations ahead of tomorrow. Good evening to you, and thank you so much for your time. Let's just start with what we've just heard, right, from the elderly. They are wanting the very thing that they always want each and every single year, to see an increase in their social grants. But when you listen to some of them now, they talk about the fact that for them there's the rising cost of living, which a lot of South Africans are talking about. And I wonder, how does the minister begin to balance all of this against, the rising debt levels that we are also facing as a country?
Very good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me. I think the first point is, if you look specifically at the social expenditure, last year the allocation in the budget was around 380 billion. That was, to be specific, 387 billion that was allocated to social development. So that includes, of course, the child grants, the SRD allocation, including also the old age pension grant. The estimated increase for this year on year is around 2.7%. That's the average annual growth. So the expectation is that from Treasury, the increment and the increase year on year, there are increases incrementally, and we'll hear tomorrow whether they link to CPI, which is expected around 4.5%. But I think the main thing is that the revenue collection vis-a-vis what we actually do collect and what is expenditure in terms of all the budget votes and the allocations will really be at the heart of whether then the strategy is we collect more from other sources and we generate revenue from other sources, or we are increasing our debt burden so that we can offset the expenditure. The way in which expenditure and the efficiency of the expenditure is somewhat something that's not usually the focus of the budget speech. We just hear the allocations. We know in terms of the MTEF how much education, how much peace and security get, how much education and learning, how much the economic cluster will get, what happens with the wage bill of the state, and what the expectations are, and whether those assumptions for the previous year have been met. So I think in terms of revenue collection, that will be the biggest issue. We will know now whether from the last quarter, the revenue collection from the private sector, the VAT returns, Treasury will have a better sense from the Revenue Authority whether those collections are actually very close to what has been projected and how much of a deficit we are on in terms of what the projections were.
And right on that, you hear a lot of people, and even when the minister was speaking just last year, he was talking about fiscal debt levels that are getting out of hand, and we need to ensure, that the issue of debt is dealt with. We need to cut back on borrowing. One wonders, though, just how critical will this be when it comes to him speaking to South Africans tomorrow to demonstrate that government is possibly making a dent on some of the debt we've seen?
So the focus ordinarily becomes topical on debt being one. You ordinarily also hear of some of the social grants being the other. Very rarely do you hear the emphasis on growth, which is the big determinant of whether or not we have enough revenue to pay for the expenditure that is projected. So I think that, of course, debt is going to be a focal point in terms of fiscal consolidation, in terms of whether or not we collect sufficient revenue vis-a-vis our expenditure. Our debt levels right now have soared to 74% of debt to GDP. However, the debt servicing cost is what is a concern, where you're spending almost or what they call a fifth of what you collect, 20 cents out of every rand or 22 cents out of every rand to service debt. So this is highly costly because this money could be used for services. I think the very important underpinning question that the nation will want to hear from the Minister of Finance respectfully is, how are we going to get to, and I've heard a lot of economists talk to 5% growth. There's a paper I wrote called New Wine into New Wine Skin. We did a lot of econometric projections to deal with unemployment, to deal with poverty, to ensure that we have sufficient revenue collection for the growth trajectory and the underdevelopment woes of South Africa. We actually need between 6 to 9% growth. You have a base case scenario where we continue as is, and things will simply worsen in terms of the economic indices if we hold all things constant. But if you have to talk to how do we increase revenue collection, i.e., how do businesses perform and we see output? How do we have more inclusion of some of the economic areas and underdeveloped areas so that you have economic rejuvenation and not economic wilderness? How do you ensure SMMEs, together with medium, small, and also Black-owned businesses are able to contribute to the question of output. These are now the fundamental questions that will answer whether we are going to see more than 1.8% growth, which is projected, and our growth story keeps getting contracted. If you recall last year when Minister of Finance spoke, growth was projected at 1.8%. If you recall 6 months later at the medium-term budget policy statement, growth went downwards to 1.4. If you recall now, I can tell you when we are hearing him tomorrow, it is likely that growth will be revised again downwards. So the real underpinning question is, what is going to be done about what I call stagnant or growth that is simply refusing? We're on a growth track, low growth track. And we've got to hear now what are going to be done by the economic clusters together in a collaborative fashion to actually get us out of the low growth track. Because that is what's going to bolster us out of some of the problems we are talking about.
And as you speak about SMEs, it's something that the president even touched on in his State of the Nation address. So a lot of people waiting to hear on that one. But Nthabiseng, there's also that question around what some economists are describing as the Trump factor, and saying that this does have some potential risks when it comes to the economy. What does he say tomorrow to allay some of those fears of those who are wondering, especially as they look at, the exchanges that the U.S. has made towards the country and possible future repercussions?
So the reality, South Africa's exports, 20% or a fifth of our exports are actually to the US market. The reality is that the preferential access that we have to the US economy bolsters very well for our particularly agricultural products, some of our cars, and some of our manufactured goods. So these subsectors, if, and this is a big if, should we see an event adverse situation that results in some of the AGOA preferential access being limited, what it means is that it doesn't mean you will not have access to the US markets. It simply means that the cost of our goods will be higher, right, than what they currently are now. It also means we have seen now with the fund and the aid dependency that we have, particularly in the healthcare sector. I'm aware that our ARV and our PEPFAR support, a bulk of the human capacity is funded through the aid programs. What it simply means, I think, for the South African situation, on specifically look at the aid, is the issue of dependency and self-sufficiency. I think it's a question that African nations, together with South Africa, that are affected, by the halting of grants, have to relook at how do we ensure that we become economically dependent. How do we review some of our policies and some of the things that we derive as imperative for our own, let's say, in the healthcare sector? I think our strategy for the healthcare sector, and this has got nothing to do with economics, but I think from a social perspective, we have not necessarily encouraged the population to prevent themselves from necessarily getting or contracting HIV. Rather, we are saying, let's manage it. If you get it, let's manage it. What that means is that we have 8 million South Africans who have contracted HIV, but are also now reliant on ARVs, and this is funded and funded by the state. What we really need to look at is how do we get a change in culture and a change in attitude to get our people not dependent on chemicals and also pharmaceuticals, but rather not contract HIV entirely, so that they are not reliant on and dependent on this type of a support. I think that there have to be strategies that the government put in place to review what then can be done in the event that the aid isn't given. And I think this talks to sovereignty, this talks to strategies around how do we further learn as Africans to not rely on foreign aid, which is goodwill, and it can be taken back. And in such situations, how then can we learn to be dependent, and what are the things that we need to put in place? I think it's a real solid question, not just for South Africa, but I think for African nations in general, that we've got to learn to stand on our own 2 feet. I do believe that restitution and repatriation is important, but I also believe very strongly that aid can be taken. And when such situations do occur, how do we ensure that we as African nations can stand on our own feet and use our funding and our finance for the betterment and the livelihoods of our people? And I think we can. And we have sufficient revenue to reignite these budget votes to ensure that our people receive treatment where necessary, but also that support is offered to our very much needing and needed employees within these entities. But I do think that there will be a very difficult call and trade-offs that will have to be made.